Hi, I'm DAZ Lewis, and in this video I'm going to show you how to exchange an animation from DAZ Studio, bring it into Marvelous Designer, drape your cloth, and then import it back into DAZ Studio. So it's a lengthy process in which we create an animation in DAZ Studio, create the clothing in Marvelous Designer, let Marvelous Designer do the draping, and then bring it back into DAZ Studio for rendering. As I said, complex process. Let's have a look what we're going to do step by step. The first thing we're going to do is open DAZ Studio and create an animation. You can use a standard keyframe animation here, or you can use AniBlocks. I'm going to choose an AniBlock, and I'm going to show you how to transition from a static pose into an AniBlock as well. Once that animation is working inside of DAZ Studio, we're going to export it. We have two choices. We can export it either via FBX, which is a built-in format in DAZ Studio. It comes free with DAZ Studio. Or if you've purchased the Animate plugin, you can also export it as an MDD sequence. MDD is much better because it applies the mesh smoothing modifiers that are inherent to the Genesis figure so that you don't get poked through. FBX will kind of work almost, but it will cause some poke through because the FBX animation will not apply all these nice smooth vertices that make the Genesis figure and the Genesis 2 figure so special. Then once we've exported that animation, we're going to bring it into Marvelous Designer. I'm going to use Marvelous Designer 4.5 for this, and in there I'm going to create a very simple item of clothing, just a white shirt. And we're going to let Marvelous Designer use the animation to drape the cloth and animate the cloth properly. And once Marvelous Designer is done with that, we're going to bring it out again and export what Marvelous Designer has done as an OBJ sequence. There are various other ways that you can use export from Marvelous Designer, but if you want to bring it back into DAZ Studio, then the OBJ sequence is the best one, I found in my tests anyway. Oh yeah, and then we're going to bring this back, import it again into DAZ Studio, thanks to a marvelous script called Animorph by Marcus Wilm. I'm going to talk about that in more detail. The tools we're going to use are DAZ Studio 4.7. I'm going to use Marvelous Designer 4.5. And I'm going to use that Animorph script. That is something that will help us turn those OBJs, those imported OBJs, back into a smooth animation. And we're going to use the Animate plugin, which is optional but highly recommended. So DAZ Studio comes with Animate, which is usable for 30 days, and after that you can apply AniBlocks and create an animation. But to export the animation as MDD sequence, you're going to have to serialize the plugin. Let's launch DAZ Studio 4.7 and pick a nice figure. For this test I'm going to use Michael 6. I'm also going to make sure that I'll delete everything else in my scene tab here, everything except for Michael 6, because if I don't do that, it will be part of the FBX export and that will confuse Marvelous Designer, and we want to keep our animation to a minimum. I'm also going to head over to the Render tab here, and on the Render Settings tab, under General Dimensions, I'm going to pick a nice aspect ratio. Because this video is in 16:9, I'm going to stick with that, 16:9. And the render dimensions, well, I'm going to crank it up to 1920 by 1080. There, so far so good. Let's create a simple animation. Over in the Pose and Animate tab, I've got it set up so I've got my timeline on the bottom. Doesn't have to be all that big here though. There, that'll do. And I'm going to use an Animate animation. So on the Animate tab down here, which comes free with DAZ Studio, no matter if you have the full version of Animate or not, you can use AniBlocks. And on this menu here, on the bottom left, you can pick any of the AniBlocks you have installed. I'm going to use something like a boxing thing. If you hover over this, you'll get a preview. And as soon as you stop hovering, you go back to what your character is right now. So perhaps this one is quite nice, the first pose here. This, well, the first AniBlock, Michael 6 boxing. But what I want to do is I want to transition from the T pose to the first anti-block. And if I just drag in this anti-block in the timeline, then there would be no transition, and I need that transition, or rather Marvelous Designer needs that transition so that draping the cloth or putting the cloth on Michael is a little bit easier. So to get that transition, you're going to right click on the free space down here and select the second option, create anti-block from studio keyframes. Right now I don't have anything in here, so this dialog, just accept the defaults, will create a 1 second anti-block by default from the current pose. It doesn't really have to be 1 second, so I can shorten this down maybe to half a second, something like that. And I'm going to drag the first boxing block into the Annie timeline. I'll make sure there's no gap here, so let's drag that over. And then if we either move the playhead or hit play, we can see that there's a nice transition from the T-pose to the first part of the anti-block, no matter which anti-block you use. And that's part of the magic. You just drag anti-blocks in any order, you can mix and match them, you can overlay them, and the transitions will always be smooth. That's kind of the magic. But right now this is an animate animation, so this doesn't exist as keyframe. So in order to do that, again we're going to use this this space down here. Just right click on it and select Bake to Studio Keyframes. And as soon as you do that, you get that little warning here, or that little message that says you're going to transfer control from animate over to the timeline, and this clever script will now create keyframes from the animate animation. So you could go ahead and delete these blocks, because right now this exists as keyframes, and if you don't do that, then you won't be able to export the animation. Right, so let's do that thing now. We have two options to get this animation out of DAZ Studio. The first one is MDD, which is provided by the full version of Animate, and I'm going to show you both versions here. This is the MDD export and FBX export. Let's start with FBX because every DAZ Studio can use this for free. So head over to File, Export, pick a folder. My folder is this one here. I'm going to call it Animation. Be more creative here than I am. On the bottom here, under File Type, select Autodesk FBX. And as soon as you do, you get another dialog here on which you can select all kinds of things. And the thing I would recommend is stick with the top FBX 2014 binary. That's the latest version of FBX. Leave everything else as it comes and hit accept. If that's what you want to use, you don't have to do anything else. If you want to use MDD, then you have to do two things. MDD isn't actually, that doesn't contain 3D objects. MDD just describes how vertices move from one frame to another. It does not contain the OBJ, and some programs are clever enough to write that, and DAZ Studio doesn't do that. So if you want to use MDD, then you head over back to File, Export, and well, I'm just going to call it perhaps Animation again. It'll get the extension MDD when you select it down here, MDD by Animate. On the preset, select DAZ Studio. That's mainly important to get the scale right, and hit accept. And now in the background you can see that DAZ Studio is rendering this out as more or less morph. So it describes how each vertex on Michael 6 moves from one frame to another. Park the playhead back on the T-pose at the very start of your animation. That's very important. And again head over to File, Export. On the file types, select Wavefront Object, OBJ, and give it the same title. So now, right now here you can see that what's been saved was literally only animation.mdd, but nothing else. And Marvelous Designer will also need the actual 3D object, so you're going to have to export the animation.obj as well if you want to use that. Oh yeah, OBJ export options, make sure you have DAZ Studio selected here. And the implication is that in DAZ Studio, 1 unit equals 1 centimeter, and Marvelous Designer doesn't work that way. Marvelous Designer assumes 1 unit is 1 millimeter. It's just something to keep in mind on the export options later. Okay, we're done with DAZ Studio. Let's head over to Marvelous Designer. Marvelous Designer will start with the default configuration and the lady in the red dress. In order to use our own avatar, it kind of depends if you want to go down the MDD or the FBX route. I will show you both here. If you're using MDD, then you're going to have to head over to File, Import, OBJ. And this is now why we've exported both the OBJ as well as the MDD version, because the OBJ would be the avatar in its T-pose. Untick Auto Scale upon import and make sure you select DAZ Studio so that we have the same scale here. Axis conversion, all boxes should be unticked so that it comes in as we exported it. This will replace the default avatar with the one that we've created in DAZ Studio. Clothing here is still the same, so that the dress is not going to be affected by that, the default dress. But right now there's no animation in this. If you wanted to add the animation via MDD now, you would head over to File, Import, MDD Cache. First option should be fine, Standard. And select it. Again, very important on the import dialog, make sure that your avatar object is selected here. That's the only one that we have in the scene. Under scale, make sure you pick DAZ Studio centimeters. And there's one little inconsistency here under axis conversion. Make sure that the Z-axis or the Z-axis is inverted. That's important, otherwise when the animation starts within Marvelous Designer, your avatar will turn around and walk the other way. By clicking that, you make sure that doesn't happen. But only do that when you import the MDD file, not when you import the OBJ file. One of those little inconsistencies there. There we go. The dress doesn't quite fit him right now. We'll make that fit. You would typically just create new clothing, and we'll do that in a minute for the real animation. If you hit the simulate button with the animation turned off, then that will take a good guess at how to fit that red dress to Michael 6. If you fancy a man in a red dress boxing as a 3D animation. And if you now head over to the animation tab, actually let's switch the simulation off, head over to the animation tab, you'll see that if you press play now, rather slowly the animation begins. Just Michael, not the dress, because we haven't draped that yet. But this is kind of, it proves that the animation, including the textures, have been imported. So that's MDD. I'll go back to simulation, to the simulation tab here, and I'm going to try the same with FBX. With FBX, the 3D figure is already included in that, so you don't have to import the OBJ first, and in the FBX you can just, when the female avatar shows here, the default avatar, just head over to FBX and find the file that you've exported from DAZ Studio and open it. Notice that the scale dialog is grayed out here. There's a bit of a problem with Marvelous Designer right now in the current version that I'm using, which is the Marvelous Designer 4.5 2.1.87. That shouldn't be grayed out so that you can't pick the correct scale. It'll still work, but it's just something to be aware of. The main difference is that the FBX file does not contain the textures. That's we don't really need the textures to simulate our garment animation, but it's just something that, if you like to see the textures, then currently FBX doesn't show them to you. Back on the animation tab, if we click play, FBX animation will also work. So these are two ways that, if one doesn't work for you, try the other. Maybe that works. But remember that for the MDD export from DAZ Studio, you'll need the animate plugin. Let's head back to the simulation tab and remove the dress. We're going to create our own clothing item for Michael 6. I'll be very quick here. I'm just going to create a very simple shirt. Give him a color here. And give him a little bit of room for his arms. And then we'll copy this. If these don't show up in your 3D view, just click this 2 arrow type button here. That will automatically update anything that you create in here onto the 3D view. We'll move this to his back. Arrangement points and bounding volumes are not really necessary, depending on how complicated or how complex your clothing is. A little bit close to his body. Now, one other thing, the back cloth, that needs to be turned around. So flip horizontally. Looks exactly the same, but it's important for the normal orientation, or normals orientation. On the sewing tab, I'll just add a few lines here. Leave the arms open. And the rest should all be wafting around nicely. Let's see what happens when we simulate that. Just a small position shift here, and I'm going to give him some breathing room on his neck here as well. Add curvature on these 2 lines here. There. Not a masterpiece, but it'll certainly waft around when we do the animation. To make the tunic or dress or whatever we've created here a little bit more interesting, I'm going to create a new fabric. And pick a texture file. It doesn't have to be anything exquisite, but it's going to prove the point that when you use real textures, they will be exported as well. Doesn't that look lovely? Amazing. Anyway, let's go and deal with our animation now. And head over to the animation tab. Make sure you're on the first frame of the animation. And head over to, well, first of all, under simulation quality, switch it from normal to complete. That means the final result of the animated draping is going to look a little bit better. And you can also change some of these values here that will make the cloth simulation more realistic. Number of simulations from 5, turn it up a little bit. Then head over to the animation option in the menu and hit record. And this is going to take some time now, as Marvelous Designer will iterate through every frame of the animation and drape the dress around our avatar. That's it, Marvelous Designer has finished, and we can go and export the clothing animation out now. We'll do that by heading over to File, Export. And the only reliable thing that has worked for me is to use the OBJ sequence export. I'll just call it sequence. And what this will do is it will create an OBJ file for every single frame of the animation, but only one material file that describes what the textures are for each frame. And we're going to untick the avatar because we have that in DAZ Studio already. We only want our 2 pattern pieces here, which is the front and the back. If you have a more elaborate piece of clothing, then you'll see a lot more. But make sure the avatar itself is unticked. Single object, unweld, and thin should be fine. Untick the unified UV coordinates. And here's that bug in Marvelous Designer again, in which I cannot select the scale on export here. So it's now stuck to millimeters, and DAZ Studio would expect centimeters, so I'm going to have to be a little bit inventive when it comes to importing it in DAZ Studio. Just something to keep in mind. On the entire region here, play region is if you wouldn't want the transition from the T-pose to the dress, for example, you can shorten this simulation here. I'm going to use the entire thing and hit OK. There's a lot of data that's being written here. That's that. Let's go back into DAZ Studio and see how we can import that. Meanwhile, DAZ Studio is just as we left it. It's probably a good idea to save the scene just in case something nasty goes wrong. Let's make sure our playhead is parked on the very first frame. It doesn't matter if you're in the animate tab or in the timeline tab, either will work fine. Because these animate blocks, they're no longer active right now. Head over to File, Import. Navigate to our folder, and this is, you can see what's happened here on the OBJ sequence export. So we've got several OBJ files, each of them rather large depending on your clothing, on your garment, and we have one MTL file which describes the textures. This is going to be used for every single OBJ file in the sequence. Our first one, the very first OBJ file, will describe the T-pose at the beginning of the animation. So let's load that in. And this is important now because the export on the Marvelous Designer is kind of broken. You're going to have to, you cannot select the DAZ Studio scale because otherwise the dress would be 10 times the size as it needs to be. Marvelous Designer has exported this in one unit being millimeters, and 10 millimeters make a centimeter, so make sure on the scale you add 10%, or you put 10% rather than 100%. Very important. And there's our dress, including textures, just like it looked in Marvelous Designer. Very good. Let's select it here in the Scene tab. This is also very important to do that. Make sure you're no longer selecting your avatar. And this is the weird part, and thanks to Marcus Wilm, who's kindly explained that. He's my hero. He's written a script that we're going to use in a moment. Before we do, however, we need to import the rest of our OBJ animation, and we'll do that by heading over to Edit, Object, Morph Loader Pro. This is something no one would ever figure out by themselves, but yeah, this is how you do it. Edit, Object, Morph Loader Pro. On the top here, where it comes to importing the geometry, make sure you choose Show Individual Settings, which brings up the Scale menu here. And make sure you select 10% here as well. Otherwise, all the other pieces of the animation will also be 10 times the size. I hope this is a bug that's going to be fixed soon in Marvelous Designer, so that we no longer have to do that and we can just stick to the DAZ Studio scale here. On the bottom of the window, choose More Files, select that. Head over to the rest of your animation and select basically everything that we haven't loaded so far, excluding the first object. So the first one we've already loaded. Let's skip that and select the second one. Scroll down to the very bottom and hold Shift while selecting the last object in the sequence. And this is going to now utilize all the other OBJ files in the sequence and turn them into morphs for our first one. So excluding the first object, which we've already loaded, select the second one to the last one and hit Open. This is going to be added to a nice list here. Click Accept, and then Morph Loader Pro will go to work adding every object as a morph to our dress. Plenty of success messages, that's always a good sign. Click OK, and that is that. So technically what we have now in our dress under parameters, we now have no morph for the first frame. For the second frame, we would have how the dress would have morphed in frame 2 of the animation. frame 3, frame 4, frame 5, and so forth, lots of morphs. So technically what we could now do is do nothing on the first frame, go to the second frame, switch this morph onto 100%, go to the third frame, switch this morph off, go to the third morph, switch this one on, and so forth for I don't know how many hundreds of images we have in our animation. Well, 225. And that's of course very tedious, and thanks to Marcus Wilm, he's written a script that will do exactly that for us. So let's utilize that. In the Scene tab, make sure your dress is selected, and you can find that script in the content library. I would suggest it's just a simple zip file, unzip it and copy it to your DAZ Studio application folder. There's something called scripts, which if you do that, it will let you find that here in the under scripts. There it is. I have it twice because I think once I've copied it to my content library and then I've copied it to my application folder as well. And it's called animorph. Double click that, the script opens one window, select the first button here to proceed. And that will now have done exactly what I've just described in the background. This means when you move your figure, the dress morphs with Michael. Notice the dress isn't a conforming item of clothing, it's a separate animation that kind of runs. Even if we switch Michael off, it will just run its own course here by itself, and it'll be synchronized with Michael because we've used the same length of the animation. Well, let's park it somewhere here, perhaps pick a nice camera angle. And you've got the simulated cloth. Is that cool or what? There is one problem with this approach, and that is, if we look closely perhaps somewhere here, behind the figure, we'll see a lot of poke through. This is really ugly, and sadly this has happened because of the FBX route that we went down. It's free, but it does create some problems, and they happen because, well, it has to do with the Genesis figure. If you look at Michael's arm here, this little bend, that has been improved when I let go of the mouse, or if I pose the figure like so, and then you see this this ugly crease here, and as soon as I let go of my mouse, there's a smoothing modifier applied to the figure, and that makes bends much more palatable, much nicer. So this is something that Victoria 4 never had, but the Genesis and the Genesis 2 figures, they have that, and it's something that when you export the file via FBX is not applied. But if you export the animation via MDD, then those vertex modifications are applied, and therefore the cloth can be draped much better, much more accurately in Marvelous Designer. That's because Marvelous Designer then has the correct object to drape the cloth around. So here Marvelous Designer had the unsmooth version, did a correct job, so it's not a Marvelous Designer problem, it's an FBX problem, and therefore we now have a bit of poke through. So you either have to be really creative when you use FBX and hide parts of the figure, or you go down the MDD route. I have done that. I've just gone back to Marvelous Designer and imported that animation again. So sequence 1 was our original FBX approach, and the second one I've just imported, just like I've just shown you with the OBJ sequence, was the MDD import. And that, if you compare it, works without any poke through. So there you have it. If you want good results, go with MDD. If you want a quick and free test, go with FBX and be creative. But I highly recommend you purchase the animate plugin and license it in DAZ Studio so that those poke-through issues do not happen. That was it. I hope this was helpful. If you have any comments about this video, leave it in either on YouTube or on the article that I'm posting it on. If you have any more experiences, any other funky ideas, please let me know how to improve this workflow. And yeah, don't forget to subscribe to my channel and share this video with friends, family, and total strangers. Bye for now. I will see you next time.